it's safe to say that LucasArts have never made an outright bad game. Their list of titles spans multiple genres and themes, but the one thing that stands out is their affinity for Star Wars games. One of these games is Star Wars Dark Forces, a first-person shooter released in 1995 running on the Jedi engine, which was also used in their other game, Outlaws, as well as the Dark Forces sequel. Dark Forces is arguably one of the best shooters from its era, and despite a few shortcomings, it's still a great game that will appease even the most hardcore of Star Wars fans. You play as a mercenary named Kyle Katarn, taken on a series of missions for the Rebel Alliance. Around the time before the first Death Star was built, the first mission even requires you to steal the Death Star plans. Initially, these missions just involve things like stealing certain pieces of intel or sabotaging Imperial bases, before Kyle uncovers something called the Dark Trooper Project. The Dark Troopers are basically stormtroopers on steroids, and they're seen as a huge threat by the rebels, despite the fact that Kyle is able to kill them with ease. I'm not kidding, you fight two different versions in the game and they're both pushovers. Anyway, that's the plot. Along with your companion Jan Ors, you go from planet to planet, sabotaging the Empire's plans along the way. Jan also plays something of a pivotal role in the game, as most of the time you have to backtrack to the beginning of a level when your objectives are complete so she can pick you up in her ship and end the mission. Unlike other games of the time, there's no quick save option. You choose a mission from the main menu and pretty much have to finish it in one sitting. Whenever you're killed, you get revived in a nearby area, providing you've got lives remaining. When you're out of lives, it's game over and you have to start the mission all over again. This can make the game a bit more challenging, and I'm not even sure I'm entirely fond of this system, but it does help to differentiate the game for the most part. In between the missions are animated cinematics that feature characters from the films like Jabba the Hutt and even Darth Vader. The guy who does Vader's voice does a pretty good job as well, I have to admit.
The Emperor has approved your test demonstration, General Mock.
Kyle is surprisingly one of the least developed characters in the entire game, as he mostly just stands around grimacing in the cinematics. It's quite a contrast considering how fleshed out he gets in the sequels. Overall, these look pretty simplistic by today's standards, and truth be told, they are pretty boring at times with very limited sound and music. But you really get the sense that a lot of effort went into making these, and the amount of fan service in some of them is fantastic. This really feels like a Star Wars game through and through. In-game graphics are a mixture of highly detailed sprites and 3D environments. Your main enemies are stormtroopers and other Imperial officers, as well as various species of bounty hunters that would like nothing more than having Kyle's head on a plate. I don't want to say too much about the enemy types, because part of the fun of playing through the game is coming across them for the first time and instantly remembering where they fit into the original films. I mean, you may not know what they're called, but you will know them. One boss fight in particular is an awesome surprise. People who've played the game will know exactly what I'm talking about. A few of the weapons in game are taken from the films, like the stormtrooper rifles and thermal detonators, though they have included some new original types as well, to mix things up. The only issue I have is that none of these new weapons are really all that good. I mean, they're not bad, it's just that the stormtrooper rifle is so effective against pretty much everything. It fires pretty fast, is accurate at medium to close range, and ammo is always in plentiful supply, making the others kinda redundant. You'll probably play around with the new weapons the first time you get them, just out of curiosity, but you'll pretty much end up never using them again. In fact, I'd even say that a weapon like the mines, for instance, are just flat out useless. These weapons and other sound effects have been lifted straight from the films, which is a good thing. From that iconic blaster sound, the chatter from stormtroopers, through to the various bleeps and bloops of the droids, it's all great stuff. Unfortunately, the music is made up of much more simplistic sounding MIDI files, which isn't all that great. They're familiar tunes and all that, but they do show their age. Though this kind of soundtrack was pretty standard for the time, so you can't really knock it for that. Another thing that makes the game feel so authentic is the environments, from the dimly lit hallways of Imperial bases through to the graffiti-stained walls of Nar Shaddaa. Everything is firmly kept in line with the visual motifs from the films, and it still does look pretty appealing, even if the game is almost 20 years old. There's a series of environments that look like the hallways from Princess Leia's ship in Episode 4, and the interiors of the various Star Destroyers, which are my favourites. Some of these levels are absolutely huge in size, which is pretty damn impressive, though this can also be a bit of a nuisance, as it can be really easy to get lost or confused with the layouts. It doesn't affect every mission, but there are a few that require lots of backtracking and running in circles to flick switches and get through timed doors. I found myself walking around empty levels for like 10 or so minutes every now and then because I just couldn't figure out where the hell I was supposed to go. It's not key hunting so much as it is switch hunting, if that makes sense. There's a level set entirely in a sewer system that will really test your patience, and at times it's almost pitch black, which sucks. This level design flaw is probably the game's biggest problem, and will either make or break the game for most people. At the end of the day, I probably wouldn't refer to Dark Forces as a Doom clone, to be honest, because that couldn't really be further from the truth. People seem to think that just because the game was a first-person shooter at the time that it was copying Doom, which is a little bit ignorant. But that's game journalists for you, right? It was one of the first-person shooters I can remember playing that had platforming puzzles and had actual objectives, instead of it just being about having a start point and finding a button to exit the level. If you do want to check this game out, which I would recommend, then the best way to play it is with something called the XL Engine source port, which allows you to run the game in full 1080 with mouse support and various other tweaks. It's kind of funny going back and playing it now, as it really hasn't aged all that bad. In fact, the pixelated visuals kind of add to its charm. In terms of a shooting game, it's easily one of the best of its time, and in terms of a Star Wars game, it's also one of the best in that regard. I would think that the Dark Forces and Jedi Knight series should ultimately be played by both Star Wars and shooting fans alike, and there's no better place to start than right here.